immediately claiming central territory. This opening aims to establish a commanding presence and dictate the early game's direction. Developing the knight to f6 immediately challenges white's central pawn and prepares for rapid piece activity, subtly aiming to control key squares and hinder white's pawn expansion. Developing a knight here prepares castling and contests the center, subtly influencing the pawn's structure. Preparing for fianchetto, this pawn advances to support the bishop's long diagonal influence. Pinning the knight immediately creates significant central tension and forces black to consider their development carefully. Developing the bishop to g7 solidifies the fianchetto, eyeing the long diagonal and preparing to castle, a common and sound response to white's aggressive pawn and piece deployment. Developing the knight to d2 supports the central pawn push and prepares for a kingside castling maneuver, aiming for kingside safety. Castling wisely shores up the king and prepares for midfield action, a sensible defensive maneuver. Launching an e4 pawn thrust boldly claims central territory, aiming to shatter black's kingside fianchetto and open lines for bishop activity. Boldly challenging white's central pawn mass, black immediately seeks to disrupt the harmonious pawn structure and open lines for active piece play. Striking at the fianchettoed bishop immediately alters black's pawn structure, creating doubled pawns and weakening the light squares around the king, a positional concession that might prove significant in the middle game. Accepting the exchange solidifies black's pawn structure, though it creates a backward pawn on the f-file. This offers white opportunities to target it later, but also grants black a potentially strong outpost for their knights on the now open e-file, and the bishop pair is now equalized. Opening the central e-file now grants white a powerful attacking avenue towards black's uncastled king, a significant positional advantage to exploit. Reclaiming the pawn with the queen immediately reintroduces a powerful piece to the center, contesting white's central pawn control and preparing to activate the queen's influence across the board. Developing the bishop towards the center solidifies control over the d5 pawn and prepares to connect the rooks, aiming for a more harmonious setup despite the doubled f-pawns. Challenging white's central grip, this maneuver liberates black's queenside and aims to disrupt the harmonious piece placement white has carefully cultivated. The pawn push immediately contests the e4 square, potentially opening lines and creating dynamic imbalances, while preparing for further development and central pressure. Unlocking the center with a pawn sacrifice, white aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially exploit the open lines that will emerge, creating dynamic play and opening avenues for piece activity. Recapturing the pawn reclaims material equality, but opens the long diagonal for white's king's bishop and weakens black's pawn shield, demanding careful queen activity to compensate. Preparing to connect your rooks and potentially bring them into the game via the central files, *00*** initiates a vital phase of development, aiming to consolidate white's pawn structure and bring the king to safety behind a now solidified pawn chain. Unleashing development, the knight reclaims central influence, eyeing potential outpost squares and reinforcing the d5 pawn's future prospects while preparing for pawn advances on the queenside. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure now anticipates black's potential central pressure, aiming to create a more robust pawn chain that can withstand further advances and potentially open lines for the rook on the c-file later. Sensing the opportunity to challenge white's central pawn structure, black introduces this bishop, aiming to coordinate its pressure with the knight on c6 against the d4 square and potentially target the weakened pawn chain if white were to advance. Refocusing the central pressure, the rook's re-entry to the e-file now directly challenges black's control of that open territory, aiming to create immediate complications and potentially exploit any lingering weaknesses around the black monarch. Reshaping the central pawn structure after the exchanges, black now mobilizes the rook to the d-file, a crucial artery for influence and potential invasion. This redeployment signals an intention to contest the open file, create attacking possibilities against white's d-pawn, and potentially support a queenside expansion or even a direct assault on white's relatively exposed king. The interplay of pieces on this central highway will be paramount in determining the game's direction. A bold bid to seize control of the queenside and cramp black's development. This action aims to exploit the slightly exposed nature of the black queen while simultaneously preparing for potential central advances. Shifting the queen to the queenside, away from the immediate central skirmish, attempts to leverage the open c-file and prepares for potential queenside expansion. But it might cede some central influence and leave the black king slightly more exposed to diagonal threats from the white bishop. The queen's redeployment to b5 immediately challenges the advanced black pawn on c5, forcing a decision and aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure while potentially creating weaknesses. Exchanging queens here simplifies the position, entering an endgame where black's doubled pawns on the f-file become a significant structural weakness. Initiating an exchange that simplifies the position, white liberates the c3 pawn and targets black's queenside pawn structure, potentially leading to an open c-file after the capture. Initiating a knight transfer to a more active square, the knight repositions itself towards the queenside, aiming to influence the center and potentially probe white's pawn structure. This maneuver seeks to redeploy forces, offering a flexible outpost from which to contest central squares and create new attacking ideas, particularly if white doesn't react precisely to its presence. It's a subtle but important step in building a more dynamic piece coordination. A bold repositioning, the knight abandons the center for a skirmish on the flank, aiming to disrupt black's queenside structure. This knight's journey signifies a shift in white's strategy, trading a central presence for potential tactical opportunities, and aiming to exploit any weaknesses that might arise from black's somewhat disjointed pawn formation. Observe how the knight's new post on d4 creates a degree of central tension, indirectly supporting the e-pawn and potentially eyeing the weak squares around black's king if the opportunity presents itself. White is gambling that this knight's repositioning will sow discord in black's camp, potentially creating favorable exchanges or opening lines for attack. Consider the psychological impact of this knight's relocation. It's a statement of intent to actively challenge black's pieces and not merely react. Reclaiming the initiative for black, this maneuver brilliantly repositions the bishop to a more active square, eyeing white's somewhat isolated queen's pawn and simultaneously preparing to contest the d-file, a crucial open file that white has begun to stake a claim in. The bishop now also acts as a valuable defender of the kingside, while its previous diagonal was somewhat passive. The knight's repositioning to f1 aims to prepare for a potential kingside advance, perhaps by swinging over to g3 or h2, while simultaneously freeing the e-file for the queen or rook. Pressing on the queenside, this pawn advance seeks to gain space and disrupt white's coordination. Shifting the bishop to e2 now allows for potential central pawn advances or prepares to contest the e-file, while also creating a clear escape route for the king if the queenside becomes too active. This maneuver repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to challenge white's control over the kingside while simultaneously aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure. Securing that kingside pawn structure prevents black's knight from hopping into the promising f4 square and initiates a subtle kingside expansion. A sharp knight relocation, aiming to destabilize the central pawn structure and create dynamic imbalances by probing the d4 square once more, potentially forcing a concession or opening a line for further offensive action. Initiating a pawn structure shift, white aims to disrupt black's harmonious piece placement and capitalize on the resulting pawn island. The exchange of knights clears a central file, potentially opening avenues for future rook activity and creating imbalances that can be exploited later. This pawn doubling, while creating a structural weakness, also solidifies central control and offers a clear target for white to develop an offensive strategy around. Observe how the queenside now presents a different dynamic. Black recaptures, simplifying the position by eliminating the knight and establishing a connected pawn majority on the queenside. This exchange strategically weakens white's queenside pawn structure slightly and opens a diagonal for black's bishop. Clearing the path for the rook to dominate the central file is paramount, especially as the pawn structure offers less dynamic potential and the game drifts towards an endgame where piece activity will be decisive. Initiating a pawn advance to the 5th rank, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's knight outpost on d4 and potentially create dynamism on the kingside. Unlocking a central outpost for the white knight becomes the primary objective now, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses around their king. Reclaiming the central files becomes a priority as the exchange of rooks opens up the board, inviting a more active rook presence. Retrieving the rook to the open d-file solidifies control, preparing for potential advances or reinforcing against any encroaching black pieces. The rook's repositioning to the central file is a strategic pivot, aiming to establish active presence and potentially exploit pawn weaknesses on the queen side, all while preparing for a more dynamic endgame. Securing the king with an advance, this maneuver aims to untangle the monarch from its prior exposed position on the back rank. Retreating the bishop to f8 may seem passive, but it skillfully avoids immediate tactical complications and prepares for a potential reactivation on the king side, perhaps aiming towards g7 or even h6 in some scenarios, while simultaneously bolstering the pawn chain's defense. Reclaiming the knight's central influence is the immediate goal, preparing to contest the open files and exploit black's potentially isolated pawns. Unleashing a knight check, black aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses around the king as the game transitions toward an endgame. Centering the monarch away from the immediate skirmish allows for a more flexible regrouping, acknowledging the potential for pawn advances later on and avoiding the immediate capture threat on f2. Revealing the white king's position with that check creates a decisive fork, exploiting the weakened diagonal for immediate tactical advantage. The king's daring dash into the heart of the battlefield, a bold gambit to break the stalemate and potentially seize the initiative, trading safety for a precarious advantage in the center, and hoping to outmaneuver the opponent's pieces in the ensuing skirmish. Sacrificing the rook here initiates a forced sequence designed to exploit the exposed white king and immediately create significant material and positional advantages through a series of exchanges that leave black with a decisive material edge. The immediate coronation of the white king to a less exposed position, away from the murderous diagonal opened by the black bishop, is paramount, even if it means surrendering the last vestiges of central pawns and accepting a constricted pawn structure. The pawn advances to h5, a seemingly innocuous step, yet it subtly alters the pawn structure, potentially opening avenues for future kingside activity, or, conversely, creating weaknesses if black doesn't manage the ensuing pawn pushes carefully. It directly challenges white's pawn chain and forces a decision on how to react, potentially drawing the white king further into a more exposed position if the pawn advances further. Sensing an opportunity, white initiates an ambitious pawn push aimed at gaining queenside space and restricting black's bishop, though it does commit the pawn and could potentially weaken the kingside if black finds a way to exploit the newly opened diagonal. Bringing the bishop back to the e7 square fortifies the passed pawn on h5 by providing a defensive anchor and also prepares for potential counterplay on the queen side, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure after the upcoming b4 capture. Sensing a slight positional imbalance with black's bishop on e7, nc aims to either exploit the d6 square for a knight outpost or to simply gain space and restrict black's piece mobility, particularly the bishop on g7, which is now partially blocked. Challenging the passed pawn's advance, this pawn push initiates a fight for central space and aims to disrupt white's king's safety by forcing a pawn confrontation on the queen side. An opportunity to seize the initiative by centralizing your knight, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially exploit the weakened squares around their king, while also forcing a decision on the f4 pawn. A tactical reevaluation emerges as black's bishop eyes the central pawns, potentially disrupting white's pawn chain and initiating exchanges that could open lines toward the king. Seizing the open file, white's rook infiltrates the enemy's position, forcing a concession and preparing to coordinate with its fellow rook on the d-file, potentially leading to a decisive attack on black's king if the pawn structure doesn't adequately shield it. Sacrificing the bishop opens up the kingside pawn structure for black, potentially creating attacking avenues. But it also hands white a clear passed pawn on the queenside, requiring careful defensive maneuvering. Reclaiming the center with the pawn offers white a more compact structure, but it relinquishes the e-file permanently and concedes a positional advantage to black's bishop, which now has a clear diagonal. This pawn advance, while seemingly a simple recapture, significantly alters the pawn's structure and opens up tactical possibilities for black on the kingside. The doubled pawns on the f-file, a consequence of earlier exchanges, now create a static weakness that black's remaining pieces can target. Consider how this structural change will impact the play in the upcoming middle game and potential endgame scenarios. A pawn capture on the wing, now what's the objective? This foray aims to disrupt white's pawn structure on the queenside and potentially create a passed pawn, but it comes at the cost of leaving the king exposed to potential threats. Consider the immediate tactical implications. Can white exploit the weakened kingside, or will black's initiative on the flank prove decisive? Unlocking the e-file and potentially creating a passed pawn, this advance dramatically alters the pawn structure and injects immediate tension into the position. The pawn advances, opening a critical path for the enemy rook to infiltrate, immediately threatening to split the remaining defenses and destabilize the already precarious pawn structure on the queenside. The rook now aggressively occupies the 6th rank, a strategic takeover that aims to stifle black's counterplay and potentially create weaknesses on the kingside. Focusing on the king's safety, this move repositions the monarch to a potentially more secure square, anticipating the looming threat of the white rook now dominating the 7th rank. The king retreats to safety, solidifying its position behind the pawn shield as the endgame materializes. Opening up avenues for the king's advance, this pawn push seeks to create immediate counterplay on the kingside, aiming to disrupt white's recently consolidated position and potentially exploit any lingering weaknesses. Opening the g-file now offers a tantalizing glimpse into black's king's safety, a potential pathway for aggression, but be acutely aware of the doubled pawns on the h-file that could become a significant weakness if not managed carefully. This move is a gamble that hinges entirely on whether you can mobilize swift counterplay before black consolidates. Bringing the king out from its safe haven, seeking activity along the 6th rank, might appear daring, yet it's a calculated gamble to prevent white's pawns from advancing further unimpeded and to potentially create counterplay. The rook advances, eyeing the king's exposed pawn structure, a bold thrust towards potential weakness. Challenging the isolated king's sanctuary is paramount, forcing it into a precarious dance across the board's center. Asserting dominion over the queen's flank, the advancing pawn aims to disrupt black's cohesive structure and create a passed threat. Inviting the rook to penetrate the queenside creates immediate tactical complications, potentially opening up lines for a decisive attack. Opening the c-file provides an immediate threat to the rook on a4, forcing black to address it and potentially giving white some breathing room. Sensing a tactical opportunity on the queenside, this pawn advance bravely ventures into enemy territory, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create a passed pawn of its own. The rook's aggressive thrust to a6 immediately targets the vulnerable pawn on b4, forcing a difficult decision for black regarding its defense. Challenging the rook's occupation of the 4th rank, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's pawn advance and potentially liberate the king's safety by forcing exchanges. The white pawn advances, a decisive push towards creating a passed pawn and potentially forcing a breakthrough on the queenside, creating immediate tactical demands on black's king and structure. Escaping the rook's grip, black's king ventures out, seeking refuge and perhaps a tactical trick amidst the pawns. The rook now exerts pressure along the 6th rank, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create mating threats around the king. Bringing the monarch closer into the fray, the black king boldly ventures towards the queenside flank, aiming to participate in the ongoing pawn struggle and potentially create counterplay against white's advanced pawns. Seizing the open file with the rook immediately pressures black's isolated pawn, creating immediate winning chances by forcing concessions or creating passed pawns. escalating the skirmish with a tempo-gaining check, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and force concessions in the center. The monarch bravely steps into the storm, a daring maneuver to avoid the immediate checks while simultaneously offering itself as a target for a potential passed pawn advance. The rook's entry onto the second rank, despite the king's precarious position, immediately creates a dangerous threat along the open file, forcing white to react decisively or face immediate material disadvantage. The rook's repositioning to the 8th rank finally exerts pressure along that crucial open file, aiming to exploit any lingering weaknesses in black's pawn structure and potentially threaten the lone king. A desperate attempt to disrupt the inevitable march of the white rook, hoping to snag a pawn with the king exposed on the 2nd rank. Unleashing the king to defend the pawn structure, a daring gamble as the monarch ventures into the fray, potentially a crucial defensive anchor or an exposed target in this sharp endgame. The black king, exposed and vulnerable, steps into a perilous dance, a stark contrast to the solid defensive structures usually sought in such late stages. A decisive royal chase commences, forcing the opposing monarch into a perilous exposure on the open board. The black king, having ventured too far from its protective pawns, now finds itself directly in the crosshairs of the relentless white rook. This audacious advance creates an immediate, unavoidable threat, essentially forcing a desperate measure or a significant material loss. The king's exposed position now becomes the immediate focus as the rook slides into a controlling rank, threatening to sever any remaining defensive connections. A desperate check, attempting to disrupt white's triumphant march towards the 8th rank. The monarch scurries, seeking refuge from the storm, but the persistent opposition's rook and pawn advance, aiming to sever its escape routes and create a decisive mating net. The rook's descent to the 2nd rank initiates a desperate attempt to revive a flagging initiative by disrupting the pawn structure, though it may prove a tactical gamble rather than a sound positional play at this stage. The king's centralizing journey, aiming to support the queen's offensive posture and potentially join the queenside pawn push, demonstrates a bold endgame strategy despite the apparent risks. Pushing the g-pawn here is a bold attempt to create counterplay, aiming to open lines towards white's king by potentially creating a passed pawn or simply disrupting the pawn structure.